the case of mixed use, though it's been though architects had come around to accepting mixed use as something that was probably a lesson of one of the lessons that came from the failure of modernism in the urban renewal movement of the 60s and 70s here in the US, that they came to that realization probably in the late 70s and early 80s in the advent of postmodernism here. It's taken really up until maybe 10 years ago before developers and the community at large began to really understand that this was actually okay. And it wasn't so much that developers had ever bought on to modernism or anything having to do with modern aesthetics. It had more to do with the fact that zoning had offered them a tool by which to keep a kind of form of purification of the city as a means of guaranteeing a stabilization of property values. That is to say that as long as mixes of uses did not mix and contaminate one another, one could ensure that one's property values would remain fairly stable, because if you lived on a residential street, this is really the reason that zoning arose in this country in the first place at the turn of this 20th century, was that you could be sure that there wasn't going to be, I mean at least 100 years ago, you could be sure that there wasn't going to be a blacksmith moving in next door, opening a shop next to your house whose business was going to create noise and odors that would have a detrimental effect upon your property value. So there was a time in the late 19th century, I don't want to go back too far here in setting a context for it, but there was a time back in the late 19th century where there were genuine concerns about public health that came from the fact that you had some toxic industries that were actually having detrimental effects on people's actual health. But over a period of time, as those things became more technologically sophisticated, the reasons for retaining zoning had less to do necessarily purely with public health and more to do with self-interest, the politics of self-interest, which were that the mere associations of having, let's say, a bar next to your home that would be noisy until the late part of the night was considered something, rather than being a possible attribute, that there was a kind of benefit seen to the convenience or the sociability, was in fact really went to the kind of puritanical ethic, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ethic of keeping things separated from one another, so that you were not adversely affected by other things. And I think it's the same mentality that really is behind the idea of the setback, the side yard setback that separates one house from another. It's kind of an idea that, you know, everybody can kind of buffer the effects of being near one another in a way that is seen in this country as being, you know, a kind of a good thing, that's more valuable somehow. So developers have basically been working with that. I wouldn't say it's a mythology. I'd say that there's some substance to the fact that there are a lot of people who still very much believe that. But they've come up against the fact that when property values have become so high that they can no longer sustain a kind of approach to urban planning that deals with the inefficiencies of separating uses, because there simply isn't enough land to be able to give each use its own parcel. And so they've been given the authority in part by a kind of, let's say, an intellectual authority by the new urbanists. This is perhaps one of the good things, the few good things in my mind about the new urbanist movement, to believe that actually has marketability in its own right. It's not just the right thing to do, but it actually proves to work, and that some people, such as seniors and families, people who don't have enough income to own 2 cars, that there are actually real benefits to living in more of an urban setting with all of the conveniences within walking distance. Also, obviously, part of, you know, a kind of pedestrianization and kind of green movement and so on. So because it's now acquired a kind of political cachet, which has really been both. It's been in effect a confluence of new urbanism and in effect the sustainability movement. Developers want to get on the bandwagon, not because not in many cases, I think not so much because they actually truly believe it in their heart to be the right thing, but simply because it's good business. And so, so that's kind of one answer. In a way, that's a kind of one answer to your question. If I treated it entirely, but I think that architects, in the meantime, have kind of gone way beyond that. I don't think that architects feel as though mixed use. Certainly, I don't feel as though mixed use really is enough in and of itself to make good cities. I mean, sure, it's a good thing. It's better for making vibrant cities, but it doesn't by any means really begin to answer a lot of other questions that cities are really dealing with today. I, for one, think that there's something that I like to refer to as a form of radical mixed use, which to me is really what's in a way more interesting, which is to think about more unusual combinations of mixing of uses than simply the retail store below with the offices or the homes above, but actually to look for new forms of collectivity, new forms of lifestyle, which suggest new mixes of uses, not simply the traditional, what I guess I would term generic forms of mixing, if you understand what I mean. So that would have to do with, say, looking for synergies, programmatic synergies between, let's say, seniors and children, child care centers, or mothers who work, or parents who work in child care centers and other things. Probably these are things that in Sweden, are very far ahead of where we are in the United States. But our definition, at any rate, of mixed use here has only now in the last 10 years, in terms of the way that developers and planners think about them, tended to be limited purely to the most common form, which is retail and residential, because even that has been considered radical. But for architects, I think that for today's cities, it's still far behind the pace at which we really need to understand how our cities have changed from what they have been to what they really are today.